In this video, we're going to discuss database programming in Java, and that has to do with this PowerPoint right here, which is part of the class notes. And in addition, we'll be using, if I scroll down here to the code examples, we'll be using this database example. And you'll also notice that I have a couple of other files, SQL files. These are going to be our sample databases that we're going to do in Oracle. We're going to make use of Oracle, so make sure you have Oracle installed on your machine, which you should have if you took CIS 330. And so we've got the DDL. Remember that DDL stands for Data Definition Language, so these are creating the tables of our employee database, and the DML, Data Manipulation Language, and that's where we've got some insert statements that are actually inserting records into those tables. We'll see the details of those in a little bit. And then we also have this database example zip file, and this is actually an entire Netbeans project. And it's got a package in it that has a couple, it actually has a couple of packages in it that has some sample Java code, but it also includes, and you're going to need this, the Oracle driver, and that's in a jar file. Jar stands for Java Archive file, and we haven't really made use of a jar file, which is basically containing a library of functionality that we need in order to work with an Oracle database. And we have not yet used some external jar file before. We've always been using basically the core Java class library, and now we're going to be using something in addition to the core Java class library, but very tightly integrated with the core Java class library, as we'll see. So these three files are going to be important for this lecture here, and also for an upcoming assignment that you'll be doing. And of course, here's the PowerPoint that has the information that we'll be talking about. So here we see the folder for this database example Netbeans project, and you should be somewhat familiar with the structure of Netbeans projects in terms of the folder structure by now. In our source folder, we have two packages, one called database, and that's what we're going to focus on in this lecture. And then we have another one, which after we start to learn about graphic user interface, this database with GUI example here will be relevant, but we're not going to talk about that in this lecture. We're going to focus on basically just the database stuff and not concern ourselves with the graphic user interface stuff. And you'll also notice that in this project are these two files that have a file extension called .jar. Essentially, these are zip files, and what they contain are classes, and those classes are classes that are implementing the functionality expected by a database driver. And here's one for Microsoft SQL Server. Kind of goes along with this DLL file, Dynamic Link Library file. And here's the one for Oracle. And we're going to be using, in particular, the one for Oracle, but this example allows us also to work with SQL Server as well. So we have the functionality to work both with Microsoft SQL Server databases, and anyone who's going into 484 will be working with SQL Server databases. And also we have the functionality given us to work with the Oracle databases as well. And that functionality is given to us through the classes that are created in these jar files. We'll take a deeper look at it when we get into Netbeans. The other thing that you'll notice is that we have, that I have downloaded both the employee DDL and the employee DML. Let me kind of open that one up for you. So here's the DDL, and the DDL has these tables here. We're dropping some tables. There's a department table, there's a projects table, there's an employees table, and there's an intersection table between the projects and the departments called employee project. and we can see some foreign keys, and we'll get into a little bit more depth about the structure of this database as well in a little bit. And if I show you the DML, we see a bunch of insert statements that are inserting data into these tables. So none of that should be new to you. All of you would have taken a database class by now. So here I am in Netbeans, and I had opened this project, the Database Example project, and here are the two files that we'll be focusing on. We'll spend most of our time focusing on this one called Database Example. We have another one called DatabaseMetaData Example. We'll also look at that. And then, as I said before, there's this other package that has a database GUI example, but we'll wait till later to look at that. And you'll also notice that we have in our libraries these two jar files. And when you have a Netbeans project, you can add libraries to your Netbeans project. And I'll show you that. If I go to the libraries folder here under the project, and I right-click on it, and you can see that I can add a jar or some other project or a library, or I can look at the properties. Let me look at the properties. I'll open that up, and here's the libraries property. You can see that these are the two libraries that I have added. Now, if you looked in another project, Netbeans project, you might not see those libraries added. And if I wanted to add a new one, I'll go ahead and click here, and you can see it can take me, pull up, and I can load those if I want. So those are going to be very important for us to work with, and so I've got them loaded in the project, which is why I provided that project for you. And another thing that you can actually see, if I want to go into the jar file and I open it up, you can see that that jar file has a whole bunch of packages. And one of these packages is this Oracle JDBC package, and you can see it has a whole bunch of classes. So what we have here in this library is, in fact, the bytecode of all of the classes that we're going to need in order to work with an Oracle database. And we'll, again, look a little bit more depth at how that's structured into Java as a whole momentarily. So as I said, in order to work with these examples and in order to do your next assignment, you need to have Oracle 11g installed on your machine. We have that for you to install on your machine, and that was installed in the labs, and you should have already have it installed in your machine. So you should be able to be running Oracle. And I'm going to pull up SQL command line. And if you will recall, there is the system user, which is the admin user. I'm going to connect a system, and I'm going to create this user for the employee database. None of this should be new to you. So I'm going to connect the system, and on my machine and on the machines in the lab, I just made whatever the password of PASS. For you, it might be something different. But I'll go ahead and type in my password, and I am now connected. It gives me this warning, but I should be fine. And now what I have to do is I have to create my employee database user space, grant it the privileges that it needs, and then log in as that user and go ahead and run those script files that I showed you. So I'm going to create user, and I'll give it the name emp, identified by, if you recall, this create user command is a SQL command, and this is the name of the user ID, the user space that I'm creating, and here's the password. So I'm just making it a very simple password here. I did that, I created it. You can see that I've successfully created that user. Now I'm going to grant it the privileges that it needs. Again, none of this should be new to you. I'm going to grant. We have to be able to create tables. as a privilege. We have to be able to create sessions in order to be able to log in. And then this unlimited table space to emp. So first I had to create the user. Maybe you already have such a database created. If not, then you're going to have to do that. And then I have to grant it its privileges. Oops, I made a mistake here. It's not create sessions, it's create session. So I'm going to go ahead and just, actually, what I can do is I'm going to just hit my up arrow and change this to be create session. And now the grant has succeeded. At this point, I should be able to log in as emp. So I'm going to connect as emp. And here it is. And there we have it. And if I want to see, well, what do I have? Well, you should see that I have nothing yet. I haven't created any tables or anything like that. Perhaps you'll remember the select star from cat, the system catalog. Select star from cat. And there's no rows because I haven't created any tables yet. So I will go ahead and run my script files for this. So again, I want to run this DDL to actually create the tables and the DML to populate them. And you should remember the start command. Start, and here's the employee DDL that I'm going to start. It tries to drop some tables. They don't exist, so I'm getting a few errors, and now these tables are created. If I run that thing again, those tables do exist, and so they are dropped, and then I'm creating them again. So what did we just do? We just executed these 4 SQL statements and then these 4 SQL statements to create the database. And now I'll populate the database. So I'm going to go ahead and run not the DDL, but this time I'll run the DML. And all the inserts have taken place. And remember, if I want those to be permanent, I have to commit. None of this should be new to you. So I'm going to go ahead and commit. And now the employee data will be permanent. If I want to see what tables I have, select star from cat. Those are the tables I have. I can see the departments. I can see the projects. Notice the wraparound here. So let me take care of that. A few SQL plus commands will take care of that. I'll set line size 300, set page size 30, set wrap off. And now let's try that select star from projects again. And there we have that. How about employees? And you can see we have 12 employees. And so now we have the data that we're going to be working with. This is actually the database that I'm going to ask you to use for your assignment as well. So at this point, assuming that everything has been installed correctly, I should be able to run my little example program. Let me try to do that. So I'll right-click here. I'll say Run. And it's going to ask me to enter a SQL statement. So I'll enter a SQL statement. I'll say select star from employees. So this is my Java code. I've got a system.out.println. I'm using a scanner to read the SQL statement typed in by the user. I go ahead and do that, and I get my results. So everything is good. I should be able to do another one too. I'll say select star from, say, from departments, and I have that data for us. So we're all set to go. So now let's talk about this, and this is corresponding with a couple of chapters in the textbook as well. I should say, though, these chapters aren't in the textbook itself. They're provided as online supplementary material You won't really need them because everything we're going to be talking about having to do with database programming will be in the slides in the lecture. So let's talk about how we work with databases. And we're working with it through something called JDBC, which stands for Java Database Connectivity. And it is a form of middleware that provides a connection between your Java application and a database system. And there's a whole lot of classes and also interfaces, which you remember we talked about interfaces a little bit in our last video lecture. And all of these are available in the java.sql package. And the way that these interfaces, which if you remember are kind of like classes in a way, but all they are empty shells of a class. All they have are the signatures of methods that I should be able to call in order to be able to do database functionality. How are those interfaces implemented? Through the JDBC driver. Those are the jar files that I was showing you earlier. So JDBC, a set of interfaces, classes, and drivers that allow applications to access data in the database management system using SQL. And this supports something called interoperability. In other words, I should be able to write an application that interfaces, in this case, to a database, without really worrying about what is the database vendor. Is this SQL Server? I shouldn't have to care. Is this Oracle? I shouldn't have to care. Is this DB2, which is an IBM product, or MySQL, which is an open source database, or Access, which is another Microsoft database, just desktop database, or whatever it happens to be. It shouldn't matter. I should be able to make the exact same method calls. And if it turned out that our database was in Oracle, and then we decided we wanted to migrate to SQL Server, my program should be able to interact with this new SQL Server database in much the same way it interacted with the Oracle database, with no, or at least a very bare minimum of changes to the code. And that's what this idea of interoperability is about. So here's basically our components, and we'll kind of look at each of these step by step. There's the application. That's the program that we're going to write ourselves. This is what makes use of the JDBC functionality. There's something called the driver manager, which is a class that's kind of operating in the background. We're not really going to look at it, see it. There may have been other ways to use JDBC that we would be actually explicitly seeing the driver manager. But we're going to be using other classes and whatnot, so we really won't have to worry too much about that. But it provides access to the drivers themselves. And then there's the drivers. And we saw two jar files, one for connecting us to a SQL Server database, and the other one for connecting us to an Oracle database. And those are our drivers. So the driver manager is kind of providing access to the drivers themselves. And then there's the data source itself, and that's the database and the database management system. And here's a little picture that kind of shows that as well. So let's take a look what the application is going to do. This is what we're going to do. We're going to request a connection to the data source. We're going to send our SQL requests. And whatever responses we get, we're going to have storage areas and data formats for dealing with those responses. Of course, any interaction to the user, we're going to be handling it, and we're going to be making the request to terminate the connection, and we're going to take care of the results and process them, and maybe we're going to get errors back, and we have to process those. That's going to be our job in coding our application. Then there's the driver manager. As I said, it's kind of managing all the drivers. Then there's the driver itself. So what is that going to consist of? It's going to be a set of classes in a jar file, which I showed you before, and it's implementing these interfaces. I'm going to show you those interfaces in a little bit. Interfaces meaning this class-like, sort of like a class structure in Java. Each database management system has its own JDBC driver. As a matter of fact, you can have multiple drivers for the same database management system. It could be a vendor, so the one that we get is coming directly from Oracle, but there are others that you can get from third-party vendors as well. It's the one that actually establishes the connection. It's the one that actually sends the request that our application wants to perform to the database management system. So the talking to the database management system itself is being done by this JDBC driver. And then finally, the data source itself, which, as I said, we're going to be working with Oracle, but we also have a driver in our Netbeans project that allows us to connect to SQL Server, and there's all kinds of others as well. And here are the interfaces that we're going to be working with. There's an interface called connection, kind of like a class. Not exactly a class. It has no functionality. There's nothing given to us in the Java class library itself, except for this is how we're supposed to call it. This is what method calls it's supposed to be able to respond to. We have 100% class abstraction happening here with the interfaces, because all we get is the signatures of the methods that we're supposed to call. There's this thing called DatabaseMetaData. We're going to be looking at that. Driver, data source, result set is going to be very important, as is result set metadata, as is statement. These are all going to be very important for us. And there's also some Java classes. The driver manager is one, but as I said, it's kind of lurking in the background, so we don't have to worry too much about the details of that. Let's go to the Java API so we can actually see these in the documentation. So this is all in the java.sql package. So I'm going to scroll down to the java.sql package. Java.sql. And here are a bunch of interfaces. We're going to be using connection. We're going to be using result set. We're going to be using result set metadata. We're going to be using statement. So all of these things we're going to be making use of. And there's also these other classes as well. There's the driver manager. As I said, that's something that's kind of lurking in the background. So all of these are interfaces. Let me show you the result set interface. Here's the result set interface. And it actually has super interfaces. So there's such a thing as super interfaces and sub interfaces as well, just like there are super classes and subclasses. You can have inheritance with interfaces. And if I scroll down here, let's take a look at some of these methods that we're going to definitely be making use of. For example, we have a method called next, which is going to take us to the next row. When we do a query, it's going to give us a result set, and we can loop through the result set. And then there's all these get methods, get different kinds of things, like get strings and get numbers of certain types, get floats, there's a get double, and all those kinds of things. So that's how we can actually retrieve the data in certain fields. So when we perform a query or we get a result set, we can operate with that result set. Here's another interface called statement. That's going to be important for us, because with the statement, we're going to either execute a query and get a result set back from executing that query, and we're going to pass it a SQL statement as a string, or we're going to execute an update. And when we do an update, and when we say update, I mean anything that's going to manipulate the data, such as an insert or an update or a delete. All of those would be done using the execute update method. And again, we're passing a string, and it doesn't give us back a result set. We're not doing a query, but it gives us a number, and what that number is indicating is how many records were affected by that particular update. So we have a little bit of a feel for some of the methodology that we're going to be working with here, some of the functionality, I should say, that we're going to be working with here. And as I said, as far as the Java class library is concerned, this is just interfaces. It's just kind of our contract, if you will, with the database vendor. This is what we expect to be able to call, and this is what we should be getting back. But who is it that actually implements that functionality? it's going to be the database driver. So that's why I say that this particular jar file and all of the packages and classes embedded in this particular jar file are providing a very important service for us. So let's continue our discussion here. So let's say we want to build an application in Java. Well, what does our application have to do? Well, one thing it needs to do is it needs to connect to the data source. So we'll see how to do that. Another thing it needs to do is perform its query and update operations. And we'll see how to do that. And finally, we're going to close off. It could be that we're going to have errors. Certainly, if we gave a bad SQL statement, we're going to get an error. And the typical kind of exception that we'll get back is a SQL exception. So our application is going to have to catch these. It says must throw or catch them. No. You don't want to throw an exception. I already told you that. You do a try and a catch, and you do something graceful with that exception. So let's look at some of this code. And this is actually code that we will see in our example. So we can see in our code here in our database example, we've imported java.util. We needed that for our scanner, as you've done yourself. We also have imported this other package, java.sql. We've also imported a couple of other packages, and these are packages that are found in the driver, one for the Oracle and the other for the SQL Server. And you'll notice that I've created two methods, one for connecting to SQL Server, one for connecting to Oracle. They're doing some slightly different things, but basically this is how we're going to get our connection. And remember that notion of a connection. The connection is how we are going to be able to interact with the database, as we'll see. And connection is an interface. So in each of these methods, we're basically doing a few things. One is we've got a connection string. And the connection string for the Oracle is this thing right here. That's exactly what we need. I've given it to you. It's in your example. And then we're instantiating a driver. And that's basically what we're doing here. And ultimately, we're going to return the connection itself. So this is our code for connecting to the Oracle database via the driver using the connection string. We have something similar here for connecting to SQL Server. Not exactly the same connection string, not exactly the same class that we're instantiating, but in both cases, returning a reference to something generically called a connection, which as far as Java is concerned is just an interface. And again, that is being implemented either by this driver or by this driver right here, depending on whether we're connecting to Oracle or to SQL Server. So in my main method of this example application class, I have created a variable called con, which is of type connection. It's a member variable of the class, a static member variable of the class. And I have called my con Oracle method, and notice what I'm passing as arguments. I'm passing the user ID and password of this database we just created. So again, to go back to the method itself, ID and password, you see that. And getting the connection, we had to pass the ID and the password. So that's what we are doing here. So that's connecting to the data source. And then I've got a loop. And each time in the loop, I'm asking the user to enter a SQL statement or the word quit. So if they typed in a Q, then we're going to quit the loop. And then I'm, depending on whether it's a select statement or not, I'm either calling this process query method that I've created or this process update method. So that's in my loop. I'm always asking the user to enter something. Once they enter something, either I'm doing a query or I'm doing an update. And notice it's all happening in a try and a catch. so that if I have an error, it's going to tell me that I have an error. It's going to let me try it again. As a matter of fact, let me go to Netbeans and do that. So I'm going to run it again. Here was select star from employees. Oops. Well, notice I got an exception. Why? For some reason, it doesn't like the semicolon when you do it from Netbeans. So an easy mistake to make. Select star from employees, and now I have it. Let's see what happens when I give every employee a raise. I'm going to go ahead and give every employee a raise. I'm going to do set, update, employees, set salary equals salary plus 1. Everybody gets a $1 raise. And 12 records were affected. So now if I say select star from employees again, it's giving me the results. And let's say I typed a bad table name, select star from emp, and it's giving me a SQL exception. Table or view does not exist. So that enables me to type in another one, rather than aborting, which I don't want your program to do. Let me try projects. And there we have our projects. So as I said, if it begins with a select, I'm calling process query. If it begins with something other than select, I'm calling process update. So let's see what happens in each of these cases. So when I perform a query, what do I need? First, I need a statement object. And how do I get a statement object? As you can see, I'm going to get that from the connection. I have to create an instance of statement, but the statement is an interface. I can't create an instance of an interface. So I have to get the class that implements the interface. And we'll get it through the connection, as we'll see. Then I set up my SQL query as a string. And I'm going to call execute query, which is a method of the statement. Well, it's not really a class, it's an interface, but there is something that the library has provided for us, that the driver has provided for us, that is a class that implements statement. And it's going to give me a result set. It's going to give me an instance of a result set object, which must mean that the driver library that we have has a class that implements the result set interface. So the connection, we're going to get an instance of a class that implements statement, and via the statements, by calling execute query, we're going to get a class that implements the result set interface, and then I can use next to read the records. And by the way, I can go forward or backwards, so there's next and there's also previous is another option. I can even go to the very end and to the very beginning as well as I navigate through a result set. And then get something, get string, get int, get double, get some kind of data type to obtain the data that's in a particular field. And let's see the coding of that. Oh, and then here we also have performing of updates, again creating a statement instance using the connection, again having a string that's going to be the SQL statement, and passing it to, in this case, the execute update method of the statement class. Again, the statement is an interface, but there has to be some class that's implementing it. We don't know what that class is. The Java class library doesn't know what that class is. All we have is a reference from connection to a statement. And how that statement was implemented, we don't know. Again, remember when we talked about inheritance and polymorphism. I can have a reference to a supertype that can actually be pointing to a subtype. And similarly, I can have a reference to an interface that is actually pointing at an instance of a class that implements that interface. That's the beauty of polymorphism right there. And we're taking full advantage of it here. So let's take a look at my process query method, what I'm doing. First of all, create statement, a method of the connection interface. We could look at it in the Java class library and the Java documentation. We can see it there. Create statement gives me a statement. And here the user has typed in a query. It got passed as an argument to this method. So that's the string that's being passed to execute query on this particular statement. And what is it giving me? A result set. From that result set, I can actually get some metadata. Well, what's metadata? Metadata is data about the data, right? So what do we have? We have the names of fields, we have the types of fields, how many columns do we have in our table, all that kind of stuff is metadata. So I've got one piece of metadata, which is the column count. So for a result set metadata, I can know, given I did a query, how many columns are in that query. So I'm looping here to print the names of each of those columns. Get column name at position I. Notice, however, that I begins with 1. This is another little kind of quirky thing about JDBC. We're used to zero-based indexing when we index through arrays, but that's not how it works with JDBC. It's 1-based indexing. So we're going for 1. For I equal 1, I less than or equal the column count, not I less than the column count, I less than or equal the column count. So if there are 5 fields, it's going to be field number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not field number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So keep that in mind. So this loop right here is printing the header, essentially. And then finally, we have a loop that's looping through the result set itself. That's what RS was. That's what this thing was. So the metadata came from the result set. There was a get metadata method, and we looped to print out the names of those fields. And now we're looping through the result set, and I have an inner loop that's looping through the fields. So while rs.next, it's going to keep returning something until it gets to the end. It's kind of like when you use the scanner to loop through a file, that kind of thing. So it's going to keep looping until it gets to the end. When it gets to the end, it returns a null. That's when the loop is going to end. And then notice that I have my inner loop looping again through the column count. And all I'm doing is doing the get string at position I in order to print out the value of that particular field at that particular row, and each row has a print line at the end. So, and all of this is in a trying to catch, so we're going to do some, graceful handling of errors. So here is that process query method. Let me just run it. I'll do select star from departments this time. Now, let me actually do something that has some aggregation. Maybe even a join. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a join. I'm going to say select department name, comma, first name, comma, last name, from departments D, using a table alias, inner join, employees E, and let's say order by inner join employee E on D.department ID, the primary key of the department table with the foreign key of the employees table, D.department ID, order by department name, last name, first name. And there we have it. So when we got the result set here, the column count of that result set metadata was 3. There were 3 fields. And so printing out the column name was happening here. And then going through each row and printing out the values was happening down here. I'll do an aggregation query. Let's try this. Select title, comma, count as totemps, comma, average salary as average salary from employees. So there's some, let's see if I type that in right. I got an error, not a single group function. Oh, what did I forget to do? Something that everybody should know about. I forgot to do my grouping. So I'm going to do group by title. And there we have it. We have one executive, we have 4 analysts, with that the average salary, 4 programmers, and 1 project leader. I'm not really sure why it came out like that. 3 project leaders, I should say. So that was a query. And that's what we have with this happening. Let's take a look at the update. What did the update do? And we already executed an update. We received the SQL statement. We executed the update. We received the SQL statement string. We instantiated a statement object via the connection. We performed execute update, passing that argument. It gave us a number, and then we put out a value saying how many records were affected. So the result that we get from execute update is an integer. And we ran that. We saw that. I encourage you to experiment with this a little bit. So we saw some stuff with metadata. Specifically, we saw some stuff with the result set metadata. There's also actually an interface called DatabaseMetaData where we can get some more global stuff, such as what's the version of the driver, what's our database management system, list of tables and queries, etc. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with that. And we have an example here that will take us through that. So let's take a look at what we're doing with this. You can see that we have created via the connection. So once again, we have our connection to our database, same as we had done before. Via that connection, we're calling a method called getMetadata. So a connection object has a getMetadata method. And so we've created a database metadata instance through that. And again, remember, database metadata is an interface in the Java class library, so that means there has to be some class that's implementing it, and that's what the driver is providing for us. And here's a bunch of methods that we can be calling, as you can see. And also a method here, getTables. This kind of explains to you the arguments that are being passed. And as I go through and run this, we'll be able to see what there is. So let me go ahead and do that. So that's this database metadata example. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And you'll notice that we have a lot of tables that are being shown here, as you can see. A ton of tables that are being shown here. Only a few of which are owned by EMP. So all of these, as you can see, at least by the arguments that were being passed in the code here, are owned by the database management system itself, system, all of these kinds of things. And that was being done as a result of this right here. We could also see other kinds of objects like views, but we won't worry about doing that right now. So hopefully that should give you a little bit of a taste for how to work with databases in Java. And I think I'm going to close here. We have one more major topic to cover for this term, and that has to do with graphic user interface stuff. And so we'll begin with that shortly.